Welcome back, everyone. So our next speaker is Ken Savitsky. It's a little bit of a kind of academic family reunion, and I've known Ken longer than anyone else in this room except for my wife Sharon, who's back there. So Ken was a second or third year graduate student at Cornell when I started there for my doctoral studies. And we were talking during the break about whether we knew good stories to roast David Sherman, who was an undergraduate at Cornell, and he was leaving to start graduate school at Stanford the same year that I was coming there. And Jeff was also an undergraduate at Cornell and had left 2 years before. And John, who you see this afternoon, was also an undergraduate at Cornell, but a few years later, but working in the same lab. Anyway, Ken and I were talking. We both had this memory of a party that Ken hosted at our advisor Tom Gilovich's house.
Who was out of town.
Who was out of town. So he had his graduate student house sit while he was on sabbatical, and I think there are some embarrassing stories that come out of that, but we won't. I think they're actually kind of painful, so we won't revisit them. Except we both remember we had this like party for the kind of passing of students coming and going to graduate school, and David Sherman showed up still in undergraduate mode, I think, with a giant case of cheap undergraduate beer. And then he saw that we were trying to be too sophisticated, so he left to go to some more entertaining parties. That's as close as we'll come to roasting anyone during the introductions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Savitsky.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for hosting and for having me here. So my name's Ken. I'm from Williams College, which is, as you can see, nestled in the Berkshire Mountains. Okay, they're hills. I understand. We call them mountains. So the other, speaking of mountains, the other story that Leif and I were reminiscing about was a little conference that we both went to held in the Adirondacks at this really terrific lodge, like right out of the Sundance catalog, organized by Colgate and Syracuse, maybe. And it was, so we were graduate students. I was maybe a third-year graduate student, and in the mythology of Ken Savitsky, that is the conference, that is the moment that changed everything. That's the pivot point of graduate school for me, where stuff went from not working to working, where I did the very first rendition of what would become my job talk. And so anyway, it's fun to be here at a small conference today with also graduate students, many of whom may find this as their similar turning point. I hope so. Turning point for the positive.
Not like turning away.
Yeah. The other quick story to say is that I was thinking this morning that the only other time I've been to Boulder, Colorado was circa 1987, when I was playing baritone saxophone with the Zionsville Community High School Jazz Band, and we took an overnight train from Zionsville, Indiana, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds, to play a series of gigs for in various nursing homes in and around the Boulder community. I don't know why or how that got arranged, but I do know this: we showed up, a bunch of nerdy high school students in rented tuxedos, ready to subject senior citizens to bad instrumental renditions of Billy Joel songs, and we discovered that all of our concerts had been canceled. Which was anyway, but as great as I was a little concerned that I would show up today to find out that this whole conference, just my part of it, had been canceled. So I'm glad to see. I'm still on, right?
You're still on. You got 2 minutes left.
Okay, let's get to it then. Okay, well, this is in the current issue of the New Yorker. Environmental writer Elizabeth Colbert stakes out a bold stance on Hurricane Harvey. She writes, "The Earth is warming, fossil fuel emissions are the major cause, and the results are going to be far from beneficial." The U.S. needs to radically reduce its carbon emissions and at the same time prepare for a future in which storms like Harvey, Sandy, and Katrina increasingly become the norm. So she wrote that a week ago. There's another name to add to that, and 2 more on the way, which is striking. The quote marks, I should say, around the word beneficial are a kind of mocking reference that she's making to an op-ed written by Lamar Smith, who's the Texas Republican who chairs the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, who recently wrote this op-ed in which he applauds the benefits of climate change and argues that climate change is causing, as he says, quote, beneficial changes to the Earth's geography. Oh, so there's that. As misguided as that is, and others too, she says, Bush administration, for example, as misguided as they are about climate change, Donald Trump has taken willful ignorance to a whole new level. The president has called climate change an expensive hoax, dreamed up by the Chinese. We've mentioned that earlier as well. I'm a big Elizabeth Kolbert fan. I think her writing is terrific in New Yorker. I don't mind boasting a little bit that she's my neighbor in Williamstown, which doesn't reflect on me at all. But anyway, as much as of a fan of hers as I am, what I want to suggest is that she's conflated here 2 logically and maybe psychologically separable ideas. Calling climate change a hoax surely fits under the category of climate change denial, with its own complicated psychology that I'm going to talk about. On the other hand, willful ignorance is an example of what I would like to focus on today, what I'll call environmental information avoidance, which is any tendency to distance oneself, either in a passive sense by being uninterested in or simply avoiding information about threats to the natural environment, or a more active sense, actively avoiding the opportunity, the sort of head in the sand, don't tell me I don't want to know, willful ignorance. Okay, first things first, before I get to that, the renewable resource that fuels my work at Williams is an unending slew of amazingly lovely and talented undergraduates who do all the real work here. They are all pictured here doing very Williamsy things. This could be right out of a brochure, these pictures. I do want to point out that Peter Drews, whose work on hypocrisy, which I hope to get to today, can be seen in that photo very clearly. Okay, the other thing to get to before I get to any data is to acknowledge the incredible debt that this work owes to Jim Shepard, about whom I had planned to say lots of very positive things, and wrote them all in the talk, I promise, and then found out that he would be here today, and he is in the front row. So thank you. Shepard and colleagues have done this research on information avoidance, primarily in a health domain, although some other things as well. And they define, and so can we, information avoidance as any behavior designed to prevent or delay the acquisition of available but potentially unwanted information. As they write, I love this, people engage in information avoidance every time they delay reading an email that might bring bad news, choose not to step on the scale for fear of what it might reveal, or avoid asking a question because they fear the answer. I feel like I've done all 3 of those this week. Okay, so the paradigmatic example then of information avoidance in a health domain might be a person who, despite the ready availability of cancer screens or HIV tests or medical diagnostic tests of various sorts, nevertheless prefers not to seek out that information, or they do seek it out but then they never return to find out the results. That's a thing. And so lots of really robust evidence in the health domain. And so what I want to ask is whether people show information avoidance when it comes to environmental threats. I sometimes tell my students in the environmental psych class that I teach that health psychology and environmental psychology are like twins separated at birth. You know, they've stumbled upon so many of the same ideas in isolation. Political psychology maybe too. Okay, so there's the easy answer is yes, of course, there is a such thing as environmental information avoidance. Here's one example. This comes from a book by a sociologist named Kari Norgaard, we did a study of an unnamed community in Norway and how they responded to a sudden lack of snow and a sudden warming of temperatures one winter. And she writes, individuals sometimes block out or distance themselves from information about the environment, holding information at a distance. I like the image there. Is an active strategy, not just a passive one, perhaps for people as they negotiate their relationship with climate change. Okay, that it is real is one thing. Why it happens, or when, maybe is the question, is something else. And so let me tell you quickly about 3 lines of work and a little bit about what we have found. Social psychologist Dan Gilbert has likened writing about research as being similar to being a storyteller, similar to being a fiction writer, only we tell, as he says, we tell the stories that our data give us permission to tell. So my data give me permission to tell you 3 stories. They will be short stories for today, and maybe there's more to the story after those. Okay, so you don't need to read all of this because we'll see it again. The asterisk is there to remind me to say that this classification of reasons why people might want to not find out information, might engage in information avoidance, comes from this great review article by Mr. Frimbo here. Okay. Well, one reason why people might avoid information is because once you know something, there is no longer plausible deniability. There is no longer the ability to pretend that you don't know it, and that information can obligate certain actions. I won't go into the details, but I recently, after some suspicions about what my cats were up to in the basement, bought for $12 on Amazon a black light flashlight capable of revealing hidden. And now I need a new carpet. Okay, so in their work, Shepard and his colleagues work with Jenny Howell. They for example, they do experiments where they give participants an opportunity to take an online health calculator that is capable of revealing their risk for a novel disease. It's actually a fictitious disease, so they can manipulate its qualities. And then participants are given an opportunity to find out at the end, do you want to know your risk? But you should know, if you opt to learn your risk and you learn that you are at high risk, that obligates some certain behaviors. And they manipulate then the onerousness, for example, of those behaviors. Either if you find out you're at risk, if you opt to find out your risk, and you find out that you are at high risk, then you'll have to take a couple of pills, or you have a lifetime of medication regimen ahead of you. And the finding is that people will avoid information, particularly when that information threatens their autonomy, their ability to act as they wish, to act in accordance with their desires, that restricts their freedom. The question then is, might the same be true when it comes to seeking environmental information? So for example, you might have a little energy orb like this in your house that tells you how much energy you're using. But once you know that, or you might have a home energy audit, like I did, and you might find out that your boiler and water heater are woefully inefficient and have to be replaced at great personal cost, as I did. For our study, we wanted to look at the question of personal carbon footprint. So this is a direct analog to the health study that I mentioned before. So this is, let me show you this one first. This is just a hypothetical thing. Imagine you were in a study where this happened. In a minute, I'll show you the actual thing. Okay, so participants are asked to imagine that they are in a study, and they read the following. Williams College takes global warming seriously, and students represent a test case for developing procedures for providing feedback about carbon footprints. It's part of the college's initiative to teach people to be better stewards of the environment. Love that phrase. We've developed an intensive 2.5-hour online course for students to take to learn how to become the stewards of tomorrow. College needs a vanguard set of students to take the online course, And the perfect participants are those who have a large carbon footprint. So now you have a dilemma. I've taken this test, do I want to know my carbon footprint? But now we manipulate the compulsoriness, which is a word, compulsoriness of the behavioral obligation. Depending upon condition, participants imagine that behavioral obligation is mandatory. If you find out your carbon footprint, if you opt to find it out and it turns out that you are above average, you will be required to take this online course. It's easy to know what to do in that case. Or in a free choice condition, you're not required, but it's an option. Or in a no obligation control condition, no mention of the online course at all. Just do you want to know your carbon footprint? So the first thing to see here in the no obligation condition is a pretty striking degree of willingness to learn, for participants to learn, or at least to predict that they would want to learn their carbon footprint. That's nice. But as soon as we introduce the possibility of an online course, either a mandatory or a non-mandatory, and that's interesting, I think, in particular because information seeking in the mandatory condition is correlated with, which is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily imply that this is what's driving it, but it is a little bit of smoking gun evidence that maybe decisions to avoid the information in the mandatory condition are driven by a desire to preserve autonomy. If you see the compulsory behavioral obligation as a threat to your autonomy, you will avoid the information. That correlation, though, does not emerge in the free choice condition, leading us to wonder what then is driving information avoidance in that other condition. And our idea is that it's almost like an internal behavioral obligation, not an externally imposed threat to autonomy, but an internally imposed threat to autonomy, which I think is called guilt. And so to find out, we did the real version of the study. So and by real is in quotes here, because we mocked up this fake carbon footprint calculator. Why does it have to be fake? I don't know. But we asked a bunch of questions about environmental behaviors, how much meat do you eat, how often do you drive to class, and that sort of thing of college students. And then gave them the same opportunity that we asked them to imagine in the earlier study. And we introduced a new condition that I'll tell you about. But the first thing to see is when there was no obligation to take the online course, again, in this case, perfect 100% willingness to find out their carbon footprint, which is kind of lovely. When it was mandatory, though, it was significantly reduced when taking the online course was mandatory, suggesting that the threat to autonomy does indeed drive information avoidance in the environmental domain. In these two other conditions, so again, it was correlated with perceived threat to autonomy. In the other two conditions, though, the free choice and what my student termed the awkward choice condition, which is if you find out that, if you just decide to find out your carbon footprint, and it turns out that you have a relatively large carbon footprint relative to other students, the experimenter will be in the room within a minute or two with her calendar to schedule a time for you to take the 2.5-hour class. It's still not mandatory, but she will be there to ask you in person with her calendar and a pen. And so in both of those cases, I think there's some more complex psychology going on here. Something more than just an external threat to autonomy. There's also, as I say, guilt or anticipated guilt. And so participants are engaging in a kind of guilt management behavior, avoiding information so as to forestall the possibility of feeling this guilty, awkward feeling later on. End of short story number one. Short story number two, people avoid information not just to preserve their, am I running out of time already? Okay. Not just to preserve their autonomy, but also to preserve their cherished beliefs. Finding out new information can be an assault on the things that we hold dear, and we wish to protect those things. A quick bit of background. This comes from a study on another topic that some colleagues and I did recently, in which we asked participants who had gotten positive or negative feedback from a group. So we have participants who were selected versus rejected for a coveted campus position by a selection committee. And we had participants who got positive or negative feedback that was said to come from a committee of artificial intelligence computer systems about whether or not they had a good sense of humor. The whole thing. And then the question that we asked was, how diverse do you think that committee is? And the finding is that when they got positive feedback, they were selected for the job or were told by 3 computers that you are one funny person, they thought those the members of that committee were diverse, were very different from one another. When they got negative feedback, on the other hand, rejected from the position or told by 3 computers that you're not funny, they said, well, they see things all in one way. They are not diverse. They are ideologically homogeneous. Here, I just wanted to get these words exactly right, so I quoted them here. So this is a reference to a paper by a beloved senior colleague of mine, Al Goethals. As Goethals and Nelson have noted, the diversity of a group whose members ascribe to a particular view calls to mind the navigational principle of triangulation. It also, of course, calls to mind classical attribution theory. As in the navigational analog, the greater the difference in perspectives converging on a judgment, the more confidently that judgment can be held. And we added, conversely, the more homogeneous that those perspectives, the more readily that judgment may be dismissed. The idea then is that people use their judgments of diversity versus homogeneity strategically. They deploy them so as to buttress good news by saying it has a wide base of support, and to reject bad news by saying that's only one way. Sure, the committee didn't give me the job, but they are all that kind of person who see the world in that kind of way. And so clearly that's why they fail to see all of my various strengths. Okay, the question today is, do people go looking and or avoiding information about the diversity or homogeneity of a group in a strategic fashion? So we framed this in an environmental domain by asking participants to read some statements that were said to be written by previous respondents, but in fact were written by me, about fracking. So they read either 3 anti-fracking statements or 3 pro-fracking statements. These were super fun to write, especially the pro-fracking statements, which are so creepy. Okay, so you read 3 pro or 3 anti-fracking statements, and then we say, oh, by the way, and then indicate your agreement or disagreement with the stance of those statements. And then we say we're going to ask you to say a little bit more about what you think about about your own views and the statements that you've read. But we'd like to give you an opportunity to learn more about the people who wrote those 3 statements. Do you want to know how those 3 people are similar to one another, or do you want to know how those 3 people are different from one another? And so what you can see, whether they read anti-fracking statements or pro-fracking statements, those who agreed with the statements that they read sought diversity information. They wanted to know how the 3 authors of those statements were different from one another, so as to buttress that argument and in doing so their own position. On the other hand, those who read anti or pro-fracking statements and disagreed with them, the red bars, they sought information about homogeneity. They avoided information about ideological diversity so as to minimize the footprint that these statements might have on their own ideology, or so we believe. Okay, and then number 3, the third reason why people might engage in environmental information avoidance is to manage their emotional responses. Clearly, climate change information is known to cause some worry, some dread, some distress. All of those are true. I'd like to tell you about how it can cause feelings of hypocrisy. Here is an example of an environmental hypocrite, according to the National Review. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio asserted that climate change is a dagger aimed at the heart of New York City, yet he travels 12 miles daily from Gracie Mansion to a gym in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Of course, it's Brooklyn, flanked by an entourage of SUVs. Or, that's not enough hypocrisy for you, while warning of the dire consequences if the rest of us don't urgently dial back our energy consumption, Al Gore has not made those same sacrifices himself. Last September alone, Gore's home in the Belle Meade section of Nashville consumed as much energy as a typical American family uses in 34 months. I'm sure he fertilizes his lawn. Okay, well these have all the makings of hypocrisy, which is of course a mismatch between practice and preach. So we have preaching on, they are asserting, they are warning, but then they are also practicing, oh, I don't know why that went away, things that don't fit with, what did it say? Oh, it didn't say it ever.
Consumed.
It's a PowerPoint. It says consumed, okay. So this is from the Guardian. This commentary, which I think is a really, really nice statement about what environmental hypocrisy feels like to the individual. Not just the individual accusing someone else of environmental hypocrisy, but what the environmentalist, him or herself, feels. This author writes, I consider myself an environmentalist, yet last weekend I spent 5 hours in a car dealership going through the rigmarole of getting a new car, arguably one of the most polluting devices in modern day life. I advocate buying secondhand, but I lease new. I encourage walking and biking and public transportation, and I do that sometimes, but there I was, taking the keys and driving away with a shiny new ride, producing a sinking sense of discomfort. The social psychologists in the room will recognize that sinking sense of discomfort. That's called cognitive dissonance. But it's also something that the environmentalists in the room, there's practice and preach again. Also something that the environmentalists in the room will recognize. This tension is familiar in the lives of most environmentalists, she writes. Some own cars, some still eat meat. The more famous in our midst regularly fly great distances to speak about the horrific impact of carbon emissions. So whoever it is who came the greatest distance for this conference today ought to feel ashamed.
That's Ken.
It's me. This unbearable hypocrisy is a struggle for the individual and a delight for the critic. I love that. I love that because it's two separate things. A struggle for the individual and a delight for the critic. I feel like there are two whole research careers in that sentence right there. Okay, well, so this environmental hypocrisy is a weapon for good, right? If you encourage people to recognize their own environmental hypocrisy by taking dripping swimmers on their way out of the pool, on their way into the shower, and ask them to sign a petition in favor of water conservation, and then you remind them, that's advocacy, then you remind them that they haven't always taken short showers. That's mindfulness. That's the preach part, the practice part. Advocacy is the preach part. And if you do those two in a 1-2 combination, and then you follow them surreptitiously, this is not my work. I wish this were my work. I love this study. Follow them surreptitiously into the showers, and with a waterproof stopwatch and time them while they're showering, you find that the 1-2 punch of mindfulness, of failures to live up to your own principles, and also advocacy of those principles causes a sense of discomfort, cognitive dissonance, which individuals can resolve by redoubling their efforts to take shorter showers. So hypocrisy is a force here for good. I love to lecture about this one in my environmental psychology class, and to tell the students that it's the only study that in the literature that I know of in which participants who don't know they're participants in an experiment, by the way, are surreptitiously observed while they're naked. That doesn't happen often. Okay, but I want to rain on this parade a little bit and say that hypocrisy is not always something that can be used to inspire environmentalist behavior, it can sometimes go the other way. Okay, can I have like 3 minutes? So we do these experiments in which we engage people in the opportunity to advocate for the environment by asking them questions like, would you be in favor of protecting this place from environmental threat? And when they say yes, which they of course always do, we say, oh, your responses to the previous question clearly indicate your ongoing commitment towards caring for the natural environment. Your responses have been recorded. I don't know what that means exactly, but they're out there, right? They've engaged in advocacy. From your responses, it's clear that you're someone who advocates all people taking care of the natural environment. We're assembling a list of responses that agree with that sentiment, that say, in effect, if I can do it, so can you. So we've now given people an opportunity to engage in this pro-environmental advocacy, and we give them then an opportunity to watch a video. They can opt out if they want, and that's the dependent measure if they do. And the video is the ways that international corporations have damaged the natural environment. That's awesome. I've just engaged in environmental advocacy. Now you're giving me an opportunity to scapegoat international corporations. That's lovely. Except in the other condition, the title of the video is The Ways That Eating Meat Has Damaged the Natural Environment. By the way, none of the participants in this are vegetarians. Vegetarians show a different pattern, which is interesting. And here's what we find. That under conditions of no advocacy, the relative interest in those two videos is similar. But when they watch when they're asked to consider watching the international corporations video, they are more interested in watching that after engaging in environmental advocacy. That's a sort of a scapegoating effect. And when they are asked to consider watching the meat-eating video, they are suddenly less interested. And it's correlated with anticipated feelings of hypocrisy. Let me end then by saying, where does this leave us? Because we are all, with our big carbon footprints flying here today, although using a reusable water bottle, I'd like to point that out, we're all a mix of environmental credentials. We're all terrible for the environment, and we're all wonderful for the environment. How do we resolve that hypocrisy? George Monbiot, environmental writer, says it nicely. Hypocrisy is the gap between your aspirations and your actions. Greens have high aspirations. They want to live more ethically, and they will always fall short. But the alternative to hypocrisy isn't moral purity. No one manages that. It's cynicism. Give me hypocrisy any day. The story that my data don't yet give me permission to tell, but that I hope to be able to tell soon, is when you encourage people to embrace the notion that environmental hypocrisy is inevitably going to be part of their repertoire, that it may free them up to engage more fully with environmental information. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can you want to take a question or
Oh,
two
yes,
while I pull
I do.
those in?
We're running, I guess, a little bit late, so it's probably best if we keep it to just easy questions.
You said there's a difference between vegetarians.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
So vegetarians were a relative rarity in that sample. They were something like 7% of the sample, not enough to look at in any meaningful way. But what we found is that vegetarians were just sort of across the board not interested in the meat-eating video, which is surprising in some ways, because you might imagine a little bit of scapegoating, a little bit of, haha. On the other hand, yuck. I don't want to watch it. If I'm a vegetarian, I don't want to watch a video all about meat. So it's hard to know. But I can say that vegetarians would not be expected to experience the same hypocrisy, and so would not be expected to show that pattern of rejecting the meat video more so after engaging in environmental advocacy. And in fact, they don't. They reject it equally in both conditions.
Encourage you to ask Ken more questions as
Yes.
he's gathering his meat for lunch.
Yeah.
So
Reusable water bottle.
can only get you so far.